Hello and welcome back to another Flutter tutorial. In this video, we will see how to implement MVVM architecture in a Flutter application. So without any delay, I'm going to jump into our demo application and I'll be explaining what is MVVM and how to implement it with the help of this example. So basically what it does is we will have some model classes and we will have a viewModel class, and all of our business logic will be in our viewModel class, so that the basic idea of MVVM is separation of concerns. So that means the components in your application should be decoupled as much as possible so that it can be easily tested, and also your UI will be much cleaner because all your business logic will be moved to the viewModel classes. Okay, so the viewModel will be just notifying the UI about the data changes, and the UI will not have any idea about how the data is coming into the UI. Okay, so that it can be easily tested. It's separate and it can be easily tested compared to other patterns like MVC and all. So let's jump in. So let me show the dependencies that we are going to use. The first one is the provider and the second one is the HTTP. So make sure to call Flutter packages git in the terminal to install dependencies for your project. Let me show the service that we are going to use. So it's from jsonplaceholder.typicot.com. It's a list of users. I'll be providing the link to it in the description. So let's see what's the main idea behind MVVM. So here we will have a viewModel class, and you will have your view classes, and you will have your repo classes, right? But the main business logic will be residing in the view models, and the view model will be communicating to the view and also the your repo or your local database or your files, etc., wherever the data comes in. So whenever there is data, the view model will actually notify the view or your screen where your UI is, and it will reload by itself. And that's the whole idea. So it's really simple. So the view model is actually a middleman between your view and your repo, and so whenever there is some change in the data in the view model, it will be notified to the UI and it will reload itself. So that's the basic idea. So what happens is you can actually change the view model later, and you can change the logic, or you can do anything in the view model, but the view will not be affected at all. Okay, and the view will only be displaying some of the values from that is being notified by the view model. Okay, so it's much cleaner and it's it's decoupled and it's easily testable. So that's the main idea. So keep it simple as possible, and your view will be much cleaner. So without much talking, we'll start implementing this. So it's really simple in Flutter. There are many different ways of doing this. So I'll be showing one of the ways with the help of provider. You can do with a block pattern as well. Now let's create the directory structure for our users list. So I created a folder users list. Now we need the views, view models, and the repo. So those are the three main folders we need. And additionally, I'm creating the models class, sorry, the models folder, and this is our model. I'm copying it and go to app.cubetype.io and paste it in there. Make sure to change the language to Dart and give your model name, so it will generate the classes for you, the model classes for you. Copy it, and let's go back to the editor and create a class users list model and paste it in there, so you can see all the member variables. So here is the address, which is a nested object. So it created the class for address and also the factory methods to JSON and from JSON. So let me rename this class to, let's say, user model. Okay, so list of user model. All right, now let's go ahead and create our services class. So I created the user services dot file and create the class user services. Import the HTTP package as HTTP. We will create the method which will return a future object, get users. We are returning a future object because we'll be returning multiple type of objects. So we'll be seeing that in a moment. So let's declare a var URL, uri.parse. So let me copy the URL. Okay. And let me create a utils folder and a constants.dart file and copy the URL in there. So constant string users list is equal to, and paste our URL in there. Let's import the constants file. Now var response is equal to await http.get URL. So that gets us the response. If the response status code is 200, then it's a success. Then we are going to return users list model from JSON and pass in the response body. Okay. Now let me create another file API status. So we are going to have two classes here, success and failure. That's going to take two member variables, code and a response, which is a generic object. It can be anything, so you can use it for any service calls. Okay, so that's the idea. So let me use it here. So it's gonna return success and response user list model from JSON. Let me import it again. So that's why our method has a future object as return. So similarly, it's going to return the failure object when the status code is not is equal to 200, and the error response can be any object. So here I'm setting it as a string response. So you can set it to any object you want. Okay, so that's why it's having the object type. And also you can have different error messages and error codes for different types of failures. I have already made a video on how to handle different types of errors properly in Flutter. So I'll be leaving the link to it in the description. Make sure to check it out. Now our service class is almost done, and let's copy these constant values to our constants file. So open the constants file and declare constant user invalid response is equal to 100, no internet 101, and invalid format 102, and the final one is unknown error is 103. So this is what like if you want to check with the help of these constants in the UI, you can do that, but it's up to you. Okay, all right, now let's create our view model. For that, let's go to the pubspec.yaml file. So I have already shown we have added the provider package. With the help of provider, we are going to create the viewmodel classes. So let's create the user viewmodel class and name it users viewmodel and extend the change notifier. This is important. Now let's declare some variables. Loading. Just think like this, all the variables that we used to declare in a stateful widget has been moved to this class, and whenever we want to update the UI, we will access this viewModel class, get the latest data and update it in the UI. These variables are now private because we have added a underscore in front of these variables. So we need to write the getter methods to get these variables out of this class. So get loading and also get user list model to get the user model. Now we are gonna write some more methods to set the data into these variables. So set loading, that's an asynchronous method, and set the data onto the loading variable, and I'm going to call notify listeners. This is going to update the UI or notify the UI saying that there is a new value, and that will update the UI. So similarly, we need to have the set user list model. So I'm gonna pass in the parameter and update the variable. So here I'm not going to call the notify listeners because I'm already calling it in the set loading. So we'll see how that works in a short while. So I'll declare another variable user error and set the user error as well. User error is equal to user error. Now we are gonna write the method to call our service and get the data for the user list model. So get users, set loading to true, that will update the UI. We have not returned the UI yet, so we'll see that in a short while. Call user services.get users. It's an asynchronous method, so add await onto it. Now if you remember what are the responses for this method, let's go to that class and see the responses are success and failure. So success, if the response is success, we're going to set the user list model with the response. So the response is an object, right? So response.response as list of user model. So that's what we are returning from the service inside the success, right? Now the response, if the response is a failure, we're gonna set the user error. So user error is equal to user error. Code is the response.code because we are already setting the code and error response from the service itself. Okay. Now we are gonna set the user error and call set loading to false. So if you remember, we are already calling the notify listeners in the set loading, so we don't have to call notify listeners every time in between, because finally when we call set loading to false, that's going to update the UI with the new data from all the data that we have already set. Okay, so that's a performance improvement. So so whenever you code, make sure you're not calling notified listeners too many times and refresh the UI unnecessarily. So keep that in mind when you're doing a lot of updates. Okay, now let's go on to implement the view model into our view and get the data and update the UI. So let's see how we can do that. Now go to the UI, which is our home screen, and import the provider package. And inside the build method, call context.watch and pass in the view model, which is the user's view model. Now you're going to get some errors. So go to the main.file, and here is an important step. You need to wrap the metal app, which is a root widget, with the provider widget. So return multi-provider and pass in the providers, so you can have more than one provider here, and set our material app as the child of the multi-provider. So here in our case we have only one provider class, right? So pass in the users view model here. So we are all set now. Now we can use our users view model in our classes. So whichever that comes under the material app, the root widget, we can use it there. So let's create a new method UI and pass in the users view model, and I'm gonna see if it is loading. So I'll show an empty container there for now, and if there is some error, we're gonna show some error widget. So return a container for now, an empty container for now, and let's focus on the main data here. For that, let's return a expanded widget with a list view inside it. And for the item builder, let's return a container for now. And for the separator builder, I'm gonna pass in the divider, and the item count will be users viewmodel dot user list model dot length. Refresh the UI. So we are not displaying the data yet, right? For each row, we are just returning a container. And so let me wrap the UI inside a column, because expanded widget needs a column widget or a row widget as its parent. We have set the users view model, and we are calling the set loading and pause. So we had notified listeners there, right, in the set loading method. So that's going to trigger the UI, and it's going to come here, and we need to return this expanded widget, which is a list view of the list of users, right? So I'm just returning a container with a column having a text with name and email. So remember, we have not called the get users method, right? So let's create a constructor for this view model and call get users there. Let's refresh the app, and let me put a breakpoint here and in the UI as well. Okay, it's false, so that's gonna show the empty container. Now get users, that returns success. So item count is 10 now, right? So we have the data. Okay, I think there is some issue with the UI, but we have the data right now, so we have already seen it. So let's try setting the style for this text. I'm setting the color to black, so we have the data there. It was in white color. And for the email as well, set the main axis alignment to start and cross axis alignment to start. Okay, that aligns well. Let's give it a padding. Okay, that looks good. Now let's create a folder, components. So for loading, we were just showing an empty container, right? So let's create a component for the loading widget. So a stateless widget, class name app loading, and I'm gonna return a sender widget here with a container, and child is gonna be Cupertino activity indicator. Let's give it a padding of 20. Okay, so instead of returning an empty container, we will return the app loading. So when we refresh, we should see the activity indicator. So that should be very fast here now. Okay, for that, let's change the brightness to light, and also give it a title. So let's go to the app bar, and title would be text users. So here, why don't we create a reusable component for the app title itself, so you can use it in any screen. So let's create that app title, and it's gonna accept a title text, right? So text, and pass it in the constructor. By default, I'm setting it to empty. So child a text, and set the style text style, and let's set the font size to 20 and font weight to bold. So we have a simple component there. So I'm changing the row text as well to this component. Okay, so that looks good. Now let's create a reusable component for the list row. For that, let's go to the components. Let's copy this container here and go to the components and create user list row dot dart and class user list row, and instead of that return, let's paste our container and pass in the user model in the constructor. So this dot uses user model, and import the app title here. Also, let's wrap the container with a inkwell widget so that we can add a tab to the row so that we can show the detail for each user. So function on tab and pass it in the constructor, and call users list row and pass in the user model with an on tab function. So you see that our UI has not changed a bit, right? Okay, now let's create a user detail screen, and when clicking on each row in the list view, we will navigate to the screen and show the user details. So it's coupled with an bar and title. Let's leave it empty for now, and body, which is an empty container. And let's create a new file, navigation utils, and let's write a function, open user details. This is going to navigate the user to the user detail screen. So it takes in a context, navigator.push, give it the context and the route. Route is the user detail screen. And while clicking on the row, we will open the user detail screen. So we'll pass in the context. But the user detail screen doesn't have any data right now to display, right? Because we are not sending it anything. We are not setting it in a constructor or anything. It doesn't have a constructor that accepts any user data or anything. So in MVVM, we don't do it like that. We don't send it through a navigator or something like that. We can have it in a state. So we already have a state, right? We have a user state. We can have a the selected user in the state itself, right? So let's write those. I'm gonna copy the user model here, import the provider. But how do we get the data? So let me create a new variable, selected user, in our users view model, and write a getter, and sorry, that was a wrong syntax. Write a method to set the selected user. So we will have the selected user in our view model state. So that's the function. So that will set the selected user. And now we need to use this. So on clicking of each row, we'll set the selected user by calling the user view model dot set selected user and pass in the user model. Okay. Now let's go to the user detail screen and set up the UI. So app title. So that's our widget, and call user view model dot selected user dot name. That will be our selected user. So similarly in the title also I'll set the name. So let's click on each row so you can see that the data is there. Let's give it a padding. Okay. Now a main axis alignment to start and cross axis to start. So now you can see that whenever a user is selected, his details is displayed in the user details screen. So whenever we are clicking a row in the list view, we are calling a view model method to set a selected variable, which is a selected user. Then we are getting that selected user inside the user details and displaying the data. Now let's add another functionality to add a new user to the list. So for that I added a new variable, adding user, to the user's view model, and also a getter function. Let me set the default to a new user model. Let's open up the home screen and add a button on the top right side of the screen in the up bar, an add button. So clicking on this button, we will add a new user to the list. Let's go to our navigation utils and I'm going to write a new function, open add user. That will open up a new screen. We'll be creating a new screen called add user screen. So go to the views and add user screen dot, which is also a stateless widget. So for this demo, all our widgets and screens will be stateless. So no state is allowed in any of the widgets or screens. So that's how we create a MVVM pattern. So none of the widgets or screens is going to hold a state of its own. Okay, so that's the whole idea. So our add user screen is also a stateless widget. So it doesn't own a state of its own. All the state will be managed by the view model. So for our add user also, the state will be managed by our user view model. I think that's clear. Let's create the UI for the add user screen. That will have a text form field. Let me copy this piece of code. That's how we access the view model. Let me import the provider. So now we have access to our users view model. Let's call users view model dot adding user dot name is equal to value. The value will be coming from the text form field in the onChanged function. Let's copy that, and similarly let's do it for the email. So we are setting it to the object that is in the view model adding user. Let's set a padding for our UI and a spacing after the name, and we also need a button to trigger the adding to the list, right? Basically a save button. So let's add an action with an icon button and a save icon, and let me go to the users view model and add a function add user. It's an asynchronous function, and inside that I'm gonna create a new user, and I'll be adding it to the list. So first let's validate each input. So if the name is null or empty, we're going to return false. So similarly, if the email is null or empty, then also we'll return false, otherwise it's true. Now let's use this function in the add user method. If it is not valid, return from there, otherwise add the new user, the adding user, to the user list model and call notify listeners. That will update the UI. So once a user is added to the list, I'll reset the user, the adding user, to a new user model so that it won't have the previous values when we are trying to add a new user. Let's go ahead and use the function inside the icon button, the plus button. So call await user model dot add user. Let me extract this function to a variable so that it will be much cleaner. So user added is equal to await add user, and if the user is not added, then just return, don't do anything. Otherwise, if it is added, then close that screen. So that should refresh the UI. Now let's try this. Tap the save button, but I think there is some issue, so let's find out and fix it. Let me open up the debug console, and it says Boolean expression must not be null. So our isValid function is returning a Boolean, but the add user is not actually returning a Boolean. So return true here, and let's try that. Okay, working good. So we didn't return a Boolean in the add user, so that was the issue. So we fixed it. So as you see, there is no state here, and our UI is much cleaner, and we can access everything from the view model anywhere. So make sure that your provider, the view model, is actually wrapping your screens. Okay, so in this case, in our case, our view model is actually wrapping the whole application, so we don't have to worry. Now let's go to our view model, and we had declared a user error, but we were not using it. we were actually setting it but never used it. So let's use it and show some error in the UI. So in the UI method that we wrote, we are actually checking for the error. So let me create a new component. Let me say app error. This is going to display the error in the UI. So app error is going to take a string which is the error text, and let's create a constructor that's going to accept this error text. So by default, let me set it to empty, and in the build method, let's return a container with a text widget. Set the color to red and a font size to 18. Let's add one more thing here, a visibility widget which wraps around this widget, and if there is some error, means if it is not null and if it is not empty, then only this widget will show up, otherwise it will be hidden. So I'm removing the default value as well. So let's use this in the home screen. Set the error text, which is user view model dot user error, which is an object, so convert it to string. Now let's go to our user services and create an error so that we can display this error in the UI. So let me manipulate the URL to something wrong. So you can see that it's an instance of user error, and we have a message field which we are setting in the user services, which I'm showing in the initial part of the video. So dot message, and let me set this to center. So you can see that that's an unknown error which we set in the user services. So let me revert it back, and so you can see we have set 200 as a success. So let me create a constant success equal to 200. So this is just a cleaning up of the code. So success is the status code, then we are setting the proper data back to the UI, to the view model, and then back to the UI. So you can trigger any of the errors here and see what is the response. So let me turn off the internet and see what is the error. So that's unknown error. I think it's going to the final catch block. I think I may need to add one more type of exception. I think that's called yeah, it's going here. So that's why it's showing unknown error. So what if you want to check the internet? That's error. So that would be socket exception. And let me set the message to no internet connection, and I turned off the internet, and if I refresh the UI, you can see that it says no internet connection. So that's not part of the MVVM model, just a proper error checking. So I have done a video on how to properly check errors in Flutter. You can check it out. I'll be providing the link to it in the description. And okay, so this is how the whole view model works in Flutter. You can do the same thing with block pattern as well. So this is the whole structure. So the whole idea of view model is separation of concerns and make sure your components are decoupled as much as possible, and all your business logic should be kept in your view model and nothing should go in your UI or any kind of widgets. So hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please don't forget to like, subscribe and share. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video. Bye.